Thank you. Stefan just showed me a picture of the two of us at the very first meeting in 2006. We were standing in front of the Turkish flag. We have our hands up like this. I don't know what that was about. But I had bad jet lag that day, as I recall, and I was wide awake at 5 a.m., and I wandered around for a while, and it got to be about 8 a.m., and I ran into my old friend, the late Yuri Maltsev, who was out here. And of course, Yuri says, 8 a.m., Yuri says, let's walk downtown and drink some beer. And so we did that, and Yuri got a haircut after the beer drinking, and he told me that as us guys get older, the hair in our head starts disappearing, and it starts sprouting out of our ears and out of our nose. And so the barber went to Yuri, and they noticed he had a lot of hair coming out of his ears, so he lit a match and stuck it in his ear and burned. And so ever since then, I do that about once a week, and I've only set my hair on fire 2 or 3 times doing that. So that was my first experience in Bodrum. But my topic is kind of incendiary sounding, as you can see, virtuous war crimes. And I'm going to start by quoting von Mises. In his book, Nation, State, and Economy, which was published in 1919, the year 1919, he wrote about how the 19th century imperialist powers, and he included the United States in that, often preceded their wars of what he called conquest, subjugation, and extermination, first with the dehumanization of their victims. Okay, and who they denounced as non-human. He's talking about German, British, and American imperialist powers. And he said these people that were sometimes called the lesser races of the countries that were being invaded and conquered. And these people, Mises said, were, quote, supposedly not ready for self-government and never will be. And so that's sort of the beginning of his book. And so I'm going to talk about what he meant by this, give you some examples of the American system of 19th century imperialism based on the dehumanization of different segments of the populations. And it's accompanied by something else. It's accompanied by a fake virtue on the part of the conquerors and the imperialists. And the United States is kind of unique in that case, because after the American Civil War, which was 1861 to 1865, the government claimed to have a treasury of virtue, the U.S. government. In fact, the famous American novelist Robert Penn Warren wrote a little book in 1961 entitled The Legacy of the Civil War. And this was one of the main themes of it, that the government after the Civil War claimed to have a treasury of virtue. And here's what Robert Penn Warren said. He's the author of All the King's Men, a Pulitzer Prize winning author and poet as well. You may be familiar with Robert Penn Warren. He said that the Republican Party, which essentially monopolized politics in America for the next half century, pretended that its victory in the war gave it a treasury of virtue, which was a plenary indulgence for all sins, past, present, and future. According to the doctrine of the treasury of virtue, the North, which is to say the Republican Party, became so full of righteousness that there is enough overplus stored in heaven, like the deeds of the saints, to take care of all small failings and oversights of the descendants of the Crusaders. The Crusaders being Lincoln's army, basically, creating a sense of moral narcissism that, quote, justified the Crusades of 1917 and 18, by which he meant American participation in World War I, and 1941 to 1945, and our diplomacy of righteousness with the slogan of unconditional surrender and universal spiritual rehabilitation for others. not for us, but for others. So from then on, these wars of conquest that came after the American Civil War were done in the name of moral rehabilitation of other people around the world. In fact, that was even a theme of the Civil War itself in America, where Southerners, people from the southern states, were said to be in need of moral correction. That was the main part of it, to be sure. Senator, one of the most famous American military heroes, General William Tecumseh Sherman, said this about his own fellow citizens in the southern states. He wrote a letter to his wife saying this. He says about his purpose in the war, in invading the southern states. He says his purpose in the war is, quote, this is a quote from Sherman, extermination, not of soldiers alone. That is the least part of the trouble, but the people. So he considered the people of the South to be a lesser race, to use Mises' language. And his charming wife wrote back the following. He said, I wish that the war would be a war of extermination and that all Southerners would be driven like swine into the sea. May we carry fire and sword into their states till not one habitation is left standing. And that's one of America's preeminent military hero, the wife of America's preeminent military hero, General William Tecumseh Sherman. And it's kind of ironic that his parents gave him a middle name of Tecumseh, which was an Indian name, Native American Indian name, because when the war was over, the American Civil War, the question became, well, what is the government going to do with all this virtue, this treasury of virtue, now that they freed the slaves and all that? But in the first place, Robert Penn Warren wrote that you have to forget almost all of the real history of that war and then believe in a fake history of the war. Like for example, you have to forget about or not know about the fact that the United States Congress issued a war aims resolution in 1861 stating to the whole world that the war had nothing to do with slavery, that it was about saving the Union. And Lincoln himself said that many times and so forth. You had to forget about things like that. And you had to also forget about the fact that in his inaugural address, Lincoln used the words invasion and bloodshed to describe what would happen to any state in the United States that refused to collect the tariffs on imports, which had just been doubled 2 days earlier. And at that point, there was no income tax, and about 90% of all federal tax revenue came from tariffs. And the Republican Party had just doubled the federal tax rate. And here's Lincoln in his inaugural address threatening bloodshed and invasion if you don't collect the tax, and threatening war over tax collection. And of course, he kept his promise. So you have to forget all that. You have to forget about the fact that for his whole adult life, Lincoln plotted and schemed to deport all the black people out of the country. It was called colonization. There's a book called Colonization After Emancipation that was published 7 or 8 years ago that talks about how to his dying day, he and William Seward were counting how many ships it would take to deport all the black people. And so you have to forget all that and then believe in this fairy tale that God sent Abe Lincoln to earth to free the slaves. And then Americans, therefore, became the most virtuous people on earth. And they could do anything, so that anything they did, the government did from then on, would be virtuous by virtue of the fact that it was Americans who were doing it. That's what Robert Penn Warren was saying. So the first thing they did with all this virtue after the Civil War was Sherman himself was put in charge of the military district of the Missouri, which is all the land west of the Mississippi River in the United States. And the purpose was to eradicate the Plains Indians to make way for the government-subsidized intercontinental railroads. There were the government-subsidized railroads. And Sherman himself said that the purpose of this was to make way for the railroads. They ended up killing some 45,000 Indians, American Indians, and the rest were placed in basically concentration camps called reservations, which still exist to this day. And for generations, they were the poorest places in North America, and the most squalid places. Here's something that Sherman himself said. The Indians give a fair illustration of the fate of the Negroes if they are released from control of the white people. That's General Sherman. He said, he wrote that he called for, quote, a racial cleansing of the land. Sherman also referred to Mexicans as mongrels. He said it was a nation of mongrels because there had been so much intermarriage between Indians and whites and Spanish immigrants and all that. And he didn't want America to become a nation of mongrels, he said. And so he was using that kind of language to justify the mass killing of the Indians. Okay. He said this: all the Indians will have to be killed or be maintained as a species of paupers. That's said William Tecumseh Sherman. He gave an order to one of his subordinates, General Phil Sheridan. And Sheridan, after the war, by the way, is said to have gone to give a speech to the Prussian army. And the Prussian army officers were no snowflakes themselves, were said to be shocked by the things that he told them about what happened during the American Civil War, as far as that. But he issued an order that gave, quote, prior authorization to slaughter as many women and children as well as men when attacking Indian villages, because it would be too time-consuming to distinguish between the women and the men and the children, and so they just killed everybody, dogs included, and especially the buffalo, because the Indians relied on buffalo for food, clothing. They made fish hooks out of the bones. It was their means of survival in the winters in the American West. And so that's the first thing that the American imperialists did after the American Civil War, making use of their treasury of virtue. So step number one is to dehumanize the victims of imperialism. And then step number two is to praise yourself as the most virtuous people on earth. And that eventually morphed into this idea of American exceptionalism. They didn't call it the treasure of virtue, they called it American exceptionalism. So that was the first thing that they did with this. And then not long after that, and that lasted from 1865 until 1890, 25-year war of extermination against Plains Indians. They would typically sneak up on an Indian village in the winter when all the families would be together. And by that time, they had rifled cannons and machine guns, Gatling guns. It was an early type of machine gun, and it would just kill everybody. 45,000 dead Indians over a 25-year period. And while at the same time, there was a man named James J. Hill who built a privately funded transcontinental railroad called the Great Northern. And he didn't take government subsidies. He didn't take land subsidies either, like the government subsidized railroads did. When he ran across Indians, he offered them cattle or grain or money, whatever they could trade for just rights of way through the territory. Whereas the government subsidized railroads, like the Union Pacific, would call in the army to just kill all the Indians. And it was there was a way of socializing the building of the transcontinental railroads. And in the end, James J. Hill had by far the most efficient and profitable railroad that there was, because it was unhindered by government regulation and control like the other ones were that had received all that government money. The next example of what was done with all this virtue, virtuous war crimes, remember the title of this, was the Philippine insurrection. The Filipinos have finally gotten rid of the Spanish Empire, and the Americans came in and said, "Oh no, you don't. You're going to be part of our empire now. No independent Philippines for you." And they ended up killing, the historians say, some 200,000 Filipinos, but there are some historians that say it's probably maybe 1 million that happened at that time. And that was under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, whose nickname was TR. And the media seemed to love him. My friend Tom Woods told me once he thinks the media liked Teddy Roosevelt so much because he had these big horse teeth. When he would laugh, he had these giant teeth in there. They kind of like that. I guess that's as good a reason as any to like a politician. He had teeth like a horse. And it was funny. It's funny, so they could draw funny pictures of him in their newspapers with big giant teeth like this. But Teddy Roosevelt was a real piece of work. He justified the mass slaughter of the Filipinos, just like Sherman and the others justified, with quotation marks, the slaughter of the Indians. He said this, he denounced the Filipinos as, these are the words of President Theodore Roosevelt, quote, Chinese half-breeds, savages, barbarians, a wild and ignorant people. Not very politically correct, was he? A lesser race, in other words. That's what Mises said, the lesser race. There was a United States senator named Albert Beveridge from Indiana who rejoiced. He said, the Philippines are ours forever. He would conquer the Philippines. And he said it was America's duty to bring Christianity and civilization to savage and senile peoples. Now, bring Christianity to the Philippines. At that time, the Filipinos had been Catholics for about 400 years. And so we're going to bring Christianity to the Philippines. Yeah. Senator Beveridge. It's a good name for a drunken politician, isn't it? Senator Beveridge. Jim Powell wrote a book called Bully Boy about Teddy Roosevelt, where he said this. He made a statement like this: all the great masterful races have been warlike races. So he was sort of the original master race guy, Teddy Roosevelt. And he denounced what he called the menace of peace, after which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. True story, Teddy Roosevelt. Just like Obama getting the prize. In addition to the Philippines, Teddy Roosevelt plotted against Cuba, Hawaii, Venezuela, China, Panama, Chile, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Canada as well. Could you imagine Thomas Jefferson abiding by something like this? Could you imagine there not being another revolution in America if the founding generation was still around like that fought a bloody 8-year war to escape the British Empire, and then here they have the American Empire, infinitely worse than the British Empire, and doing such things. The Philippine insurrection was followed by the Spanish-American War, which was more of the same. And then there was the conquest of Hawaii. There's another interesting story of what they did with all this virtue stored up to justify just about anything. The United States government decided to send. This is in the early 1890s. The Indian Wars are finally over. About 1890 was the end of it all. They sent an envoy named John Stevens, who arranged for American troops to land in Hawaii. And the troops were called the Honolulu Rifles. Maybe there might be some T-shirts online you can buy, Honolulu Rifles. To this, who knows? And they literally forced the king, the Hawaiian king, to sign off on a new constitution that was known as the Bayonet Constitution, because they literally held him at gunpoint with the bayonets. Well, kind of like in the Godfather movie, the scene where the mafia guy says, either your brains or your signature will be on this piece of paper. That's what they did to the king of Hawaii. And it disenfranchised all the native Hawaiians and basically franchised, gave the right to vote to primarily the white American landowners that existed in Hawaii. And so, and of course they denounce the Asians in Hawaii as an inferior race, a lesser race as well, along with most others. And then by some amazing coincidence, there was a judge that was sent down to be sort of the de facto president there. His last name was Dole, Judge Dole. And by some amazing coincidence, after this was achieved, James Dole, a man named James Dole, who was the cousin of Judge Dole, founded the Dole Fruit Company. And so that's what it was all about. It was all about being able to sell fruit, and nobody else could sell fruit. And so that's the type of thing that went on during this period of the first round of the exercising of the Treasury of virtue that the U.S. government was said to have secured during the American Civil War, and when it turned into an imperialist power. And that's why Mises included Germany, England, and the United States in talking about the imperialist powers of the 19th century in his book that was published on Nation, State, and Economy. And so the reason why I mentioned, the title of my paper or my talk is Virtuous War Crimes, and then I said the American and Israeli traditions. It really struck me, observing what's going on today that was discussed by the last speaker, that the Americans have reverted back, the American government has reverted back to its 19th century ways of imperialism and conquest in its alliance with the government of Israel. And for example, there was an article on May 21st of this year, headline article in Le Monde, the French publication, that said this: in Israel, rhetoric dehumanizing Palestinians and calls for eradicating Gaza have become commonplace. That was the headline in Le Monde. And it goes on to say that there's the dehumanization of Palestinians by government ministers, lawmakers, military experts, and public figures. And the journalist is named Luc Bronner, who wrote this, has been to justify the mass killing of Palestinian civilians, especially women and children, the destruction of entire cities, the concentration of more than 2 million people in conditions deemed unlivable by international organizations, incitement to forced emigration, and the blockade of food and humanitarian aid to the point of famine. Well, that's a mouthful there, isn't it? That's shocking. You read this, could this be true? He goes on to say that more than 53,000 Palestinians have been killed. I think it's probably 10 times that much myself. A majority of them women and children, and over 60% of the buildings have been destroyed. And it's really the same playbook as what I've just described with the American imperialists of the late 19th century. For example, a man named Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli defense minister, who called all Palestinians, quote, human animals. So there's you can't get more dehumanizing people than calling them animals, human animals. The Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said that, quote, in a few months, he was celebrating, in a few months, Gaza will be totally destroyed. And he was celebrating that. The Israeli heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu, had been calling for the dropping of nuclear bombs on Gaza. Nuke them, get it over with. Just nuke the whole population. And then also he called for the destroying of all remaining food sources because, in his words, and I'm quoting him from Le Monde, all the Palestinians need to starve. So thinks he's God, doesn't he? All the Palestinians need to starve. The president of the Knesset, Nissim Vaturi, called for basically a war of genocide he said, that would, quote, wipe Gaza off the face of the earth altogether. That's the president of their legislature. Major General Giora Island also called Palestinians human animals, quote, human animals, and called for making Gaza, in his words, unlivable. And in an especially touching statement, he denounced all the women in Gaza as, quote, mothers, sisters, or wives of Hamas murderers. So he's making the argument that every woman in Gaza is somehow related to a Hamas murderer and therefore is fair game for the IDF snipers. And the IDF army is fair game for being exterminated. This is the same kind of language. Teddy Roosevelt was mild compared to this. It was really mild and childish sounding language compared to what these people are saying. And so what's going on in Gaza, I argue, has its roots in, now that, this is an American and Israeli project. It's not just the Israelis. It's an American and Israeli project. It's sort of a reversion to this late 19th century barbarism that was all done in the name of virtue, And of course, the Israelis said, well, it's self-defense. We have a right to defend ourselves against babies running around in Gaza. We can never have another Holocaust. They always pull that out as though that could happen there. But that's their version of this. And there are no stronger supporters of all of this than Americans who call themselves evangelical Christians, like the current American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, as far as that goes. And I have my old friend Chuck Baldwin, who's been a Christian minister for 50 years. I recommend you, if anybody's interested in this, reading about him. He explains that this notion that the Jewish people are God's chosen people, that's what convinced people like Huckabee to be like they are and just excuse whatever the Israeli government does because it's God's chosen people doing it. It's kind of like the Americans after the Civil War. They thought of themselves as, the Treasury of virtue. It's sort of the same thing. But Pastor Baldwin explains in his many writings that the Christian Bible says that God chose the Hebrew prophets. He didn't choose every single Jewish murderer, rapist, thief, scoundrel on the planet as his chosen people. God would do that? It was the Jewish prophets to spread the word of God. And that's it, not everybody. But that was sort of somehow twisted for the past 100 years by biblical interpretations. And so you have all these people in America supporting this, supporting the funding of these things that are going on, an extermination of civilians because of this convoluted religious belief, in my view. So, and Chuck Baldwin, Pastor Chuck Baldwin is very convincing about this, if anybody wants to follow up on that. And so that's why I gave this whole talk the title of Virtuous War Crimes. And at the beginning of all this, when I started talking about the Civil War, Charles Adams wrote this book called When in the Course of Human Events, and he pointed out that most of the countries of the world, by the time you got to the 1860s, had all agreed, even through conventions. There was a Geneva Convention in Geneva before the Civil War. It's not the post-World War II Geneva Convention. It was the very 19th century, agreed that intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. Everybody knows that civilians are going to be harmed in a war. It's inescapable. But to intentionally murder and steal in wartime is a war crime. And Lincoln turned that all around because he had waged war on the civilian population of the South for 4 years, including when Sherman himself was bombing Atlanta, for example. There was no Confederate army there, and for 4 days, they artillery shell after artillery shell dropped on the civilian population of Atlanta, Georgia, and his military engineer was a man named Captain Poe, as in Edgar Allan Poe, Captain Poe. He told Sherman, this has no military value at all. It's all women and children and old men. And they were looking through their eyeglasses and through their binoculars and things, whatever they had at the time. And they were seeing the corpses and body parts in the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. And Sherman himself said it's a beautiful sight because it would end the war more quickly. And that's the sort of thing that went on at the beginning. And Charles Adams argues that sort of behavior turned around the sort of a generations-long success in outlawing with international law the waging of war on civilians, and because this was a total reverse of that, and then of course that provided the precedent for what happened in firebombing of Dresden and the dropping of atomic bombs in Japan, and just the waging of war on civilians with democratic warfare, right, Hans? The warfare in democracy. Okay, so that's my story for now. I tried to top the last speaker. I don't know if I did with with my outrageous assertions. But thank you for sitting still. And it's about time for my haircut. I'm going to go burn some more hair out of my nose and my ears.